Welcome to Suitcase Coder, the podcast. My name is Laura, and I'm the host of this podcast, where I track my journey from joining a coding bootcamp to becoming a freelance web developer. My ultimate goal is to travel the world as a remote developer, but until I reach that point, I will continue to share what I learn along the way in hopes to help and inspire future techies, freelancers, or digital nomads. Thanks for listening, and let's get started on episode 17. So today I will be going over some very common CSS struggles that people face when you're first learning to code. Usually HTML is followed by CSS because they do very much go hand in hand. And I by no means will be able to cover all of the CSS struggles within one podcast episode, but I will do my best to cover some kind of big topic ones. And if you would like for me to do a little bit more in-depth tutorials on my YouTube channel, please let me know and I'll be happy to do those and maybe give it a little bit more of a visual, hands-on explanation. So not to spend too much time trying to explain CSS, but real quick, CSS is basically a cascading style sheet, and what it is it adds style to any HTML page. And this styling is very useful and it's considered part of the front end because it's something that the user interacts with and that the user sees. Things like color, sizing, positioning, all of that fun stuff that has to do with styling is usually done with CSS when you're starting off. Once you get a little bit more involved as you're learning to code, you will probably end up learning some kind of framework like React or Angular, Vue, Bootstrap, all of those. But today we'll cover just basic CSS. And one of the things that I see that people first get confused on is how the heck do you tie your CSS to your HTML? Because when you're learning to code, those are stored in two totally separate files. And obviously your HTML is going to be saved as an HTML file, whereas your CSS is going to be saved as a CSS file. And yes, commonly they're placed within the same project folder. However, they still don't know that they need to be talking to each other until you tell your HTML to listen out for that specific CSS style sheet. And yes, you can have more than one CSS file within a project, just like you can have more than one HTML file within a project. Anyway, so it's a very common confusion and it's an easy fix. There are three ways to basically embed CSS into your HTML. One is to do the CSS inline within your element itself, and that basically adds the styling directly to the tag that you are writing. The second way is to include a style tag within your HTML file, and that will basically create all of your CSS. It will read CSS within these style tags on your HTML file. However, it's not the best practice. The best practice is to link your HTML file to your CSS file, and there store all of your styling stuff. So the way to do that is by using a link HTML tag within the head tags of your HTML file. You basically just create a link tag, and then when you're talking about what link it's supposed to be picking up on, that's where you put in the path or the name of your CSS file if it's stored within the same project folder. The next thing that people struggle with is how do you actually style specific tags on your HTML file? And then also how do you style the whole thing? So as you know, within your HTML file, you have body tags, and everything within your body tags, it's what's going to be displayed on your actual website. And so you can style the entire page by specifying that body tag, and in your CSS simply typing out body, open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and between those curly brackets add the styling that you want. The purpose of styling your website is to make it unique and make every element a little bit different. And so how do you know what you want to style? And the way I like to think about it is if you think of a flow chart. So at the very top, you ask yourself, what element on my website do I want to style right now? So let's say I have one paragraph that I want to make the fonts a little bit bigger. I can then use that P tag as my selector and style the paragraph. However, then you have to ask yourself, okay, if I do that, do I want to style all of the paragraphs within my website with the same styling? And you might. So that's one scenario. The next one being, what if you have several elements and they don't have to be the same tag? So maybe you have one li element and one paragraph element, and you want those colors to be red. What you could do with that is create class ID. And a class ID is basically an attribute that goes within the opening tag of your HTML element, and it's class equals quotes, and within those quotes, you're going to give it a class name. Once you give something a class, you basically are labeling it with some sort of name that's going to differentiate those elements from the rest of your website. The neat thing about classes that's different than IDs, which we'll get to, is that classes can be reused on several elements. So like I said, if you want one paragraph, one list item, and maybe one H2 tag to all have a red font color, then all you would have to do is give those elements a class of red, and then go into your CSS page and use red as your selector. Now, remember that when you are using class names as selectors, you need to start that off by a period followed by the class name and then whatever styling you want. And opposite of classes are IDs, and IDs are extremely unique labels that you add to one element. So yes, all elements on your website can have an ID, but each of those ID names is going to be different and has to be different. So let's say I just want one paragraph or one list item in my entire website to have an orange border. Well, in that case, I will give an ID to that specific list item and then style only that list item. The next thing that I know people really struggle with is at first understanding the difference between margin and padding and when to use each of those, as well as the border and the height and the width of that element. So to better explain that, I like to use the analogy of picture frames on a wall. The actual picture itself, the ones that you print out, that will be equal to whatever element you're dealing with. So it can be an image element on your website, or it can be anything else like a paragraph, a div, a list item. And so the height and the width apply to the element itself. When you think of the actual element as a picture itself and you give it a height and a width, that's similar to going to a Walgreens or wherever you print out digital photos and telling the computer to print out your pictures in a certain size. So usually pictures are 5x7, 8x10, you get the idea. And going inside out, the next thing you would see on a picture frame is that it has this white or black inner border, and those can be really, really small, or it could be a little bit bigger, and all it does is it gives it kind of like an inner frame. And so just like that, when you think of an element as your picture, you can think of the padding as the area right outside of the element itself. And a border, if you catch my drift, will be very similar to a picture frame. And just like a picture frame, you can change the size, the color, the width. The only difference there being that obviously with picture frames, they're usually equal around all four sides. Whereas on CSS, you can change that up. You can have the next one out would be margin. And margin, if you're looking at that picture frame on the wall against all the other picture frames, the margin is going to be the space between one picture frame and the other picture frame. Basically, you're giving it some space around the frame or around your element's border. So hopefully that gives a bit more visual and tactile representation of the difference between padding and margin, because I know those two can get confusing, especially when it's like invisible. Obviously, like sizing is a huge part of styling, and there's a lot of different there's a few different measuring units that you can use. One of them is the one that I use the most is px, another one is percentages, another one is em, and basically they're all the same. They all change the size of an element. I think the best way to learn different sizing units is just to use them as you learn and see which one works for you. A lot of times what I do is I'll use the percentages when I'm dealing with width, just because it's, if I only want a certain paragraph to take up like 25% of the width of the screen, then that might be easier to figure out than trying to figure out the pixels. Similar to that of the different sizing units, there's also a few different ways to add color to your CSS, and the three different ways are: one, by actually just writing out the color, so like blue, green, colors of the rainbow. The second one would be to use the hex code, and that's a £sign followed by 6 numbers, and those 6 numbers basically just give you a location, kind of like a grid location on the color wheel. The third way is using RGB, and the neat thing about RGB, which is obviously using how much red, how much green, how much blue you want to add, is that you can add a fourth element, which is alpha, and the fourth number being numbers, decimal numbers up to 1, and that dictates the opacity of the color that you've chosen. And the best way to go about choosing colors is honestly just to Google it, or there's so many online resources to be able to choose colors and look at different color palettes and stuff like that. So I would definitely take advantage of those. Of course, saying that, I do want to touch on the importance of accessibility and readability. So you don't want like a light yellow on a dark yellow, because you're just not going to be able to read that. So you do want to make sure that it's compatible, and there's also a bunch of resources for that. The last thing that I know people get pretty confused about is the different positioning on CSS, and that can really drive somebody bonkers. Like, try to center something in CSS. You'll see that it can get so extremely frustrating trying to deal with that, with the different kinds of positioning, because there's so many different ways of doing it. And I think for that, I'm either going to break it up into 2 totally separate episodes, or maybe save it for a more visual YouTube tutorial that I'll have online. If you do want that, let me know. But the last kind of two that will help ease those situations is learning something like CSS Flexbox or CSS Grids. And both are great options and both accomplish very similar things in that it allows you to structure your entire website with a given structure in place, and then you just style like those bits. And instead of having to worry about like the positioning of those things, then you just go about, once you have that in place, you just go about styling those elements that are already in the places that you want them to be. So all I'm going to say about those two is that they're both fun to play with, they're both frustrating to play with, but they might also help ease up that frustration of aligning things properly on your website. So definitely take the time to play with those. So I know that didn't cover everything, and it might not have answered your specific CSS question because I know there's so many questions out there and everybody gets confused on different parts. That sums it up for today. But before ending, this week's action item is to recreate an HTML file with a themed color palette and make sure that the colors are readable on your website. You can see the resources in the show notes or in the links below. If you have been enjoying this podcast, please don't forget to subscribe and rate it. And if you prefer watching these videos, then please head over to my YouTube channel. If you're already watching from YouTube, hello and thanks for tuning in from here.